muscular proteins. I have bone proteins. So there are different proteins. When they group themselves together to carry out a function, the group that carry out the function is called a pathway. So a digestive pathway would imply what? A machine made out of protein gears whose function is digestion. Okay? So basically, this is the fundamental nature of how the cell is assembled. Now, the gears alone don't move. So we have to cause them to move. We need a motor or a force. Now, I'm offering something special in the lecture tonight because I didn't tell you, but I will tell you now the secret of life. This is the special addition to the lecture. What is the secret of life? And the answer is this. Life is movement, action, motility, animation. Death is stillness, nothing moving. And the difference is, well, what causes life? Where's the motor? Here's the important understanding. The motor is built into the protein itself. I'll explain it to you. Consider this model we just created. And I'm going to give you a fact. I'm going to say that the two yellow amino acids at the ends are negatively charged. Both of them are negative. And the question is this. If both of these are negative, is this shape, or conformation in protein talk, is this shape or conformation more stable or less stable than this shape? Which is the more stable, this one or this one? This one. And the reason why simply is this. If two things are negative, they repel each other. Like charges repel. So the idea is when I assemble this, these two amino acids at the ends would like to be further apart from each other. So this, you're right, is more stable. Now, the secret of life. This. What's this? Well, in this case, it's going to be a positive charge molecule. Actually, if I value it, it's got more positive charge in this than there is negative in this. Now imagine if this positive charge is floating by, what's going to happen when the positive charge gets near the negative end? It'll be attracted and bind. Now, the question is this. What's the charge at this end of the molecule? What's the charge at this end of the molecule? Is this stable, this configuration, or is this one more stable? Okay, and that was the secret of life. Oh, you didn't see it, did you? Let's do it again. Works like this. Works simply like this. Take this off. What's going to happen to the shape? It's going to rotate back. Okay? This is still, it's not moving. Could be dead. I don't know. But guess what? As soon as I attach this, then what does it do? It moves. It moves. The force to make it move is built right into the protein itself. And it's mediated by this. Changing the charge causes the protein to change its charge, and as a result, the backbone moves. Movement is life. When the proteins engage, the gears start to move and then start to do their job. So the question is, what actually causes life? Well, two things. A, the protein, but that alone is not sufficient. The reason? You need the switch. There's something here to actually cause it to change the shape. In this case, the signal is what it is. Does that make sense now? So where does life come from? This would be the normal configuration of this particular assembly. Binding the positive charge to this negative end causes it to move. Movement is animation. Movement is force. Movement drives the system. The motor is built right into the protein itself. So let me just give you an example. That calmodulin we looked at. Well, there's a part of the calmodulin here where you can see the coils like these. They're called alpha helices. They're coils. They're rigid. And there's rigid. But part of the chain is kind of flexible. And that flexible place is like a hinge. So what happens if I change the charge? And now this is the actual movement of the calmodulin molecule in your body. This is the way it moves when the charge is changed on it. And this is when it's doing its work. It's like a little machine, and it's moving. And when you integrate it with all the other gears, it will engage the whole pathway to carry out its function. So we go back to our mechanism. I say, where's the motor? And the fact is, I'll tell you where the motor is. The motor is actually built right in to the protein itself, so there's no extra motor on the outside. It's built in, and now the gears run. Okay? Well, we have a problem with this, and the reason is they'll just keep running and running and running, and so I can't use that. I need to be able to stop it and then turn it on when I need the process and turn it off when I don't need the process. So Let me explain. Here's another molecule. It's not the calmodulin. This is called an annexin, and it's got the same backbone. It's not the same backbone, but you can see there's a backbone structure, a lot of rigid areas, and some more flexible areas right here. Well, what's different about this molecule is this one is activated by an actual chemical signal. No life, no behavior. Chemical signal, that's the signal, comes in. The signal binds. Protein plus signal gives you behavior. When the signal disconnects, no behavior. So what makes life work? Add the signal. Controlling the signal will control the function. Bind it, behavior. When the signal comes off, no behavior. So basically, I can turn the gears on and off by regulating the so-called signal. Okay? So I go back to my mechanism. I say, look, let's use this key up here as the signal. Okay? And so they say, well, when I want the gears to work, I provide the key. And when I provide the key and it plugs into the protein, just like this protein signal right here, when it binds, all of a sudden, it will cause the gears to move. Okay? And here's the other one. It just show you all I need is another signal. And every time I provide a signal, the gears start to move. And when the signal comes off, the gears will stop at some point, okay? So controlling it is using the signals. So let's understand something first right here. Proteins make the structure. But when I add a signal, which can be molecules or energy, and this is a new understanding because conventional biology only says molecules are signals. And this is a very important error because that's an old belief. With the new physics, quantum physics, we understand that energy is actually 100 times more active in signaling than our molecules. Energy, your thoughts are energy. That's part of it. The fields that you live in are energy. So you're moving in fields or signals that can regulate your biology. So when the signal shows up, the signal binds to the protein. And when it binds to the protein, it changes the structure, and that causes the function. And we see the function. We call it behavior. So the behavior your biology is expressing is what? The behavior is the gears moving in response to the signal. So the last part that I want to talk about before I really get to the switch part is this. There's a gauge. It's called performance. Think about it this way. In your car, a vehicle, a mechanism, gears and all that stuff, there are gauges on the dashboard. And the performance of your car is indicated by the gauges. And if something goes out of whack, you can see the gauges move. So for example, if you are driving your vehicle and the temperature gauge starts going up into the hot zone and it starts to overheat, what would you do? Okay, you don't want to answer that. Okay, I'll answer it for you. What you would do is presumably pull the vehicle over and let it cool down. Why? You use the gauge to see how the performance is, and then you have to adjust according to what the gauges say. Well, the issue about it is this. We all have gauges on our performance. These gauges represent emotions and symptoms. When you have an emotion, it's, let's say, anger. That's the equivalent of the heat gauge. When you get angry, your gauge is going up into the hot zone. What do we normally do? Well, when it comes to anger, we don't do like we do with a car. Usually when you get angry, what do? Is get more angry. You don't stop, cool down, and then let it get back into shape again. Why? We haven't noticed that the feelings and the emotions that we're expressing actually represent feedback to tell you about the performance. More importantly, the symptoms that we feel when we're not being well. What is a symptom? It's a gauge. It's telling you something's wrong with the vehicle, and it's trying to get your attention so you would drive the vehicle in a different manner. The problem that we have in the world today is this. The pharmaceutical industry, your friends, help you. What do? You have a symptom, and what do they give you? A drug. And what does the drug do? Shuts off the symptom. Now you don't have to pay attention to it. It reminds me when I was going to graduate school, I worked in a Chevy dealership. And I remember it was a Friday afternoon, about 4:30, all the mechanics had cleaned up their bays, everybody was ready to go home, and a woman came in and she was irate. She had already been in twice for the same issue. The service engine light on her dashboard, her gauge kept flashing, service the engine, something's wrong. Well, she was like, that's the second time I've already brought it in, now there's a third time and it's still doing this. At 4:30 on Friday afternoon, who wants to work on that, right? Well, everybody was quiet except for one mechanic. He said, I'll take care of that. And everybody looked at him and thought, man, what's he going to do? It's no time to work on this. It could take hours to fix this. He drives the car back into the bay, And he gets in underneath the dashboard and he pulls the light bulb out. And then after that, it only took 2 minutes, so what does he do? He has a cigarette, another can of soda, 5 o'clock, he drives it out in the front, and he says, it's fixed. And the woman gets in the car and she says, oh, wonderful, the light's not saying service engine now. And she drives off very happily. What's the point about that? When we go to a medical doctor and have our symptoms taken away, what we're losing is the gauge that was telling us that our performance was off. And this is what we have to pay attention to. Okay? Well, I'm really getting to this. Why? Because this is the control, the switch. What gives us our behavior and controls our behavior? And the answer is there's an actual switch to control behavior. If I put all the proteins of the cell, all those pathways, respiration, digestion, excretion, in a test tube, the same proteins are in the cell. This is alive. This is not alive. It's just a mixture of chemicals. What's the difference between the two? And the answer is control. In here, I can control when the pathways are active and turn them on and turn them off, and I can't control it in there. What makes the control of your biology? And the answer is the brain. But in the case of the cell, it's actually the membrane. The membrane of the cell is what controls it. The membrane's the skin of the cell. Now, let's take a look at it. Here are my proteins that we talked about before. And my proteins, where are they present? They're inside the cell. So when I look at them, I say, oh, well, around the outside of the cell is the skin, just like your skin. And the signals that control it come from the environment. So the signals have to go through the membrane before they can engage the system. So this area here represents where the switch is. Because if I let the signals in, then I can regulate it. So the membrane, the skin, is the brain because it has the switches in it. Very interesting point. In embryology, the brain of the human is derived from the skin. And the reason is that the skin is the interface between the outside world, the environment, and the inside world of biology. So the skin is the barrier. It's your brain. So looking at the cell, how does your brain work? It's a model of this brain right here. It's all built on the same system. So how does it all work? It works like this. Inside the cell are the protein pathways. Outside of the cell are the signals that control the proteins. For the signal to activate the protein, it has to hit the membrane where there's a switch. The switch at the cell membrane converts the environmental signal into a signal that engages with the protein and makes behavior. It's the environment that engages your behavior. You are controlled by what you see outside in the environment. And the interesting part about the switch is it takes a primary signal called the environmental signal, and the switch converts it into a biochemical signal that will engage with the protein. That is called the secondary signal. What does the switch look like? And we're almost finished with the biology. What does the switch look like? It looks like this. 2 components. One is called a receptor. The other is called an effector. The receptor sees the environmental signals, and then when it sees a signal, it engages this protein, which generates the signal that controls behavior. Now, do you have receptors? Come on. Where are they? Name some. Just right off the top of your head. Name them. Eyes, ears, nose, taste, touch, pain, pressure. Where do you think all these receptors are that I just talked about? They're in your skin. The eyes are developed from the skin. The tongue, this is developed from the skin. The touch receptors, the pain and heat, they're all in your skin. So again, get the parallel. You and the cell are not that different. You look slightly different, but you have the same mechanisms going on. And the reality is, so when light comes into your eye, the eye converts it into a nerve vibration that sends it into the brain. So the eye sees the light and then converts it in a secondary signal that goes inside and regulates the brain, okay? Well, this would be the equivalent of the eyes and the ears and the nose of the cell. It sees the environment. When the signal is received, it connects to this guy, which engages the signal to control the biology on the inside. So to show it to you how it works, let me just show you a switch. This is the signal receiver, the eye. This is what generates the secondary one, but when no signal is there, they're not connected. This is the connector. In order for this connector to work, a signal has to show up. What happens when a signal binds to a protein? Remember? Changes the shape. When the signal is there, then what happens is the primary signal is picked up, and the secondary signal is created by this. Primary signal picked up, secondary signal is what drives the biology. When the signal goes away, this thing disconnects and no switch. So I activate the switch by what? The environmental signal activates the switch. Important to recognize The control of your biology is not on the inside. The control of the biology is from the outside. It's the environment that you live in. So, we got down to the nitty-gritty now, and it goes like this. This is the molecular switch that controls the gears with their motors to make everything work. And the switch is two parts, a receptor and an effector. And I could say, well, the switch is the receptor/effector. Or I can name it by what it does. So I say, what's the function of the receptor? The receptor, like eyes, ears, nose, is awareness of the environment. That's what receptors do. What's the function of the effector? Well, that converts the signal into a physical response. So I say the effector makes a physical sensation after the receptor receives a signal. I hope that makes sense. Why is this important? Because, number one, do you recognize what this is? This is a critical nature right here. This is the switch that controls the biological mechanisms. There's 100,000 of these switches, different ones on the surface for each of the different functions we got. But I want to give you the name for the switch because there's a name in the dictionary that was there long before I knew the switch existed. What is the switch? Well, what's the definition of the switch? Awareness of the environment through physical sensation. I go to the dictionary, and there it is, the word perception. Perception. Awareness of the elements of the environment through physical sensation. What's the switch that controls your biology? Perception. It's how you see the world. As you see the world, you adjust it. If there's something scary, that's a switch, and it causes your biology to respond in fear. If there's something warm and loving, that's a switch, and it gives you warm, loving growth processes inside your body. Perception is what controls your biology, not genes, which is very important because each of us sees the world slightly differently, don't we? We all have different perceptions, and these are the perceptions that drive our biology. So when I put my flow chart back together again, we knew that the signal altered the protein, changing the structure, leading to its function, which is behavior. But now we know this. The environment is the source of the primary signal, and then the membrane is where the switch is, and the membrane generates the secondary signal, which then drives the protein, et cetera, et cetera. And the point about it is this. The environment is our source. The environment is what we really are. We are made in the image of that environment. And the reality is the environment is the source, and the membrane is the perception switch. The membrane has perception of what's going on and adjusts the behavior. Perception drives behavior. Okay? Well, I told you before, well, let me conclude with this. Perception controls behavior. Perception controls behavior. Okay? But here's an interesting point. I said there were probably over 200,000 different proteins that make up a human body. The proteins are the mechanism. Not all the proteins are always present. Sometimes a signal comes from the environment and I don't have the protein present in my cell right then at that moment. Can I make the protein? Yes. Where do I get the plans to make the protein? And the answer is the DNA. Now we bring the DNA in. Why? What's the function of the DNA? The DNA is the blueprint to make the proteins. And proteins wear out, and that's why I need the DNA. So when I wear out a protein, I can make replacement parts. The proteins are created from DNA blueprints. So how does the DNA work, though? This is, now again, we always thought the genes activate themselves. We always say, you've heard this, a cancer gene turned on. You've heard something like that, I'm sure. The reality is this, a cancer gene cannot turn itself on. This is a biochemical fact. Genes, this is a fact. Genes cannot self-activate. A gene cannot turn itself on. If you actually had a cancer gene and it really created cancer, when would you express that cancer? And the answer is, at the moment you were born, you would already have the cancer. Why? The gene would have created it. You cannot have a cancer gene in your body, then say at some point the cancer gene turned itself on. You can have an abnormal gene in your body, and then when you turn it on, it didn't turn on by itself. It was turned on by the environment or your perception of the environment. Cancer is a perception of trying to deal with a hostile or an environment that doesn't support you in some way or other, okay? Well, how does a gene work? And this is the beautiful part. How a gene works, and the answer is this. Inside the nucleus of the cell, and this is a special technique where you can stain all the chromosomes which are inside the nucleus. And so when I open up the nucleus after staining it, that's when you see the chromosomes. You have two sets of chromosomes, one from your mother and one from your father. And this technique allows you to stain the pairs. You have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each of the different pairs has a different color, and that's how you can match them up. But the issue is this. What am I staining? Well, it's very important. And the issue is we know that the nucleus is 50% DNA and 50% protein. But the issue is this. We didn't know what the protein did for 50 years. You know why? Very simple reason. In 1953, when we decided genes control biology and they'd isolate the chromosomes and get the genes, they threw away the protein for 50 years. The reason is this. Who needs to study the protein when you're studying the DNA? So they threw it away. And after 50 years, some people started to get wise and go, 50% is a lot of protein in there. What do you think the protein's doing? Boy, that was one of the most important changes in the current issues of biology today. What is the protein doing? Let me explain it to you. The protein forms a sleeve around the DNA. The DNA is not free in the nucleus. It's covered by a sleeve of protein. They're called regulatory proteins. Great name. Now you might get the idea. How do they regulate? And it goes like this. It's called epigenetic control. It's a new word. Epi means above. We now recognize there's a control above the genes that controls the genes. The genes aren't controlling themselves. And so basically, what are the genes? The genes are just blueprints for the proteins. But how do you know which proteins you want? It's not up to the genes, it's up to epigenetic regulation, which is the environment controlling gene activity. It's the environment that controls the genes. Nucleus doesn't know what's going on. The environment tells the nucleus. How does it do it? This is the beautiful part. It's so simple. It goes like this. Imagine my bare arm as a gene. And if I wrote the genetic code for, let's say, blue eyes on my arm, the little bases, the DNA bases, and I'd ask you a question. If you could see all the bases, I'd say, right now, can you read the gene for blue eyes, yes or no? Okay, but I said, well, wait, what does the DNA look like when it's back in the nucleus? Because this is not the natural situation. Oh, back in the nucleus looks like that. Can you read the gene for blue eyes, yes or no? If you want to read the gene for blue eyes, what do you got to do? Take the cover off. What's the cover made out of? And what causes a protein to change shape? The perception, the signal. The signals cause it to come off, and the signals allow you to read the gene. The gene didn't read itself. So how does it work? It works simply like this. Inside the nucleus of the cell are chromosomes, which are DNA strands covered up by proteins. At the beginning of each different gene segment, there's a special protein called a regulatory protein. What activates the regulatory protein? A signal. If a signal binds to a regulatory protein, it causes it to change shape. And when it does that, it causes the DNA to be exposed. So basically, how does it work? It works like this. Chromosome, DNA inside. Here comes an environmental signal from perception. Binds to this particular protein, which activates this particular gene. How does it activate the gene? The answer is the protein changes its shape, and all of a sudden, guess what? Now the gene is exposed. Now you could read the gene. Before you couldn't read it. Reading the gene is a process called transcription. And what is it? It's a protein that will come up here and make a copy of this DNA strand. This copy is called messenger RNA. That is the blueprint that will go into the cell so I can make the protein that it needs. And when I have the blueprint, I don't need the DNA anymore, so the signal pops off, and guess what? Boom! Covered up the gene. Relevance about all of this? What controls genes? Perception controls genes. It's how you see the world that controls the genes in your body. Why this is relevant? Abnormal perceptions, misperceptions, by definition, will select inappropriate genes and inappropriate functions in your body. So perception becomes the important point. But what about our dogma? Central dogma, DNA, RNA, and protein, primacy of DNA? The answer is it's incomplete. Why? Add the regulatory proteins, the epigenetic control. But you also know you can't remove the regulatory proteins till you have what? Environmental signal. And all of a sudden you see it's the top of the flow is not DNA. It's not the primacy of DNA. What is it? The primacy of the environment. It's your interaction in the environment that selects your gene programs. If you're in a very supporting, nurturing environment, you'll express functions of the system to promote growth. But if you're in a toxic, angry creating environment, an environment that conflicts with your life, you're going to select different programs. Well, let's talk about this here for the reason is now that we know that perception controls genes, we can put these two things together. We can say perception controls behavior because the signals from the environment engage the mechanism. Perception controls genes because the signals from the environment expose the DNA. So perception controls biology. This is the important understanding. Perception controls biology. Well, let's talk about this perception business for a second. At the surface of the cell, those are the switches called perception. These switches respond to the signals and they engage the behavioral mechanism of the cell. It's your perception that controls this biology. Well, the relevance about that is, let me tell you two important characters about perception. Perception, number one, perception represents a unit of awareness. Very simple. Here's a perception of an apple. This is a perception of a pear. Oh, I have different perceptions. Each perception identifies something in the environment. Here's a perception of my mother. Here's a perception of my father. That's two different perceptions. Each one is a unit of awareness. But, now this is critical, perceptions are also given a survival value. Each perception you see influences your life. And so there's a value when you learn about that perception, you give it a value of whether it's supporting your life or something that threatens your life. And that's very important because ever after that, when you see that perception again, you will automatically say, oh, I remember that threatened me. Or this was a great thing. I love that. And so what is loving or hating or fearing something? These are the values of the perception that you've acquired. You learn these perceptions. This is very important. What are the perception values? Well, basically, at the fundamental level, there are two values to perception. One, perceptions that provide for growth and reproduction. Things in your environment that nourish you, encourage you to thrive in the world, you give them a growth value to them. And you engage in behaviors of growth. Growth is opening up your arms and taking it in. Growth is things that are out there giving you sustenance and supporting your life. But you need other mechanisms of survival besides growth. You have to understand protection. They involve different activities. Growth is encouraging the system to facilitate its own homeostatic balance. Protection, you don't go into protection like, hey, open your arms up. What do you do in protection? You close them down. Interesting. Growth, open. Protection, closed. Everything that you've identified in your life that threatens you, a perception, when you experienced it, you gave it a value of whether you thought it was promoting your life or taking away from your life. So why is that important? Because after you learn it the first time, if it comes again, you're already prepared to make the appropriate response. So every perception you have supports growth or protection. Does it take energy to grow? Yes. Does it take energy to protect yourself? Yes. Very important point. The reason is this. If you engage in a lot of protection, where do you get the energy from to do that? You take it away from growth. In other words, you can't fund everything infinitely, so the more protection you think you need, the more you engage in protection, the more you have to shut off growth. So the simple truth about survival is this. Survival is equal to growth divided by protection. And in this world, as you can see in the last year or so, what is happening to our needs? We are living in this. Why is this important? Because the more we do this, the less we do of that. It's just a matter of mathematics. You have a checkbook, you have a balance, you write checks for protection. And as every time you write a check for protection, the budget balance drops, and it gives you less for growth. And the problem is, do we need to have all the protection that we are told we need to have? And the answer is absolutely not. It's a belief system. People are making money from it. And the reality is, if you would take back the effort you put into protection, you know how your life would expand and grow? And the reason is why? You're just fiddling away all your energy trying to protect yourself. From what? Ghosts, goblins, real things? Let me explain something that's so fundamental that it was so simple and profound, it just like stopped me in my tracks. I cloned human cells. That's what I was doing. And I can tell you a simple experiment. In the Petri dish, I have my cells, and in front of this cell, I put some nutrients. In another Petri dish, in front of the same kind of cells, I put toxins. I know exactly where the cells are going to be when I come back in an hour or two. And the answer is illustrated. After a period of time, cells will move toward the growth nutrients for growth, opening and going toward. But in regard to toxins, what do? Back up, close away, and move the opposite direction. Does that make sense? Well, then look at this. Cells cannot move in both directions at the same time. Relevance? When you're in protection, you cannot grow. The cells can't do it. Cells in protection close themselves off. Cells in growth open themselves up. And why this is relevant is it's the perceptions of the environment that are stimulating growth or protection. It's our perceptions that make that decision. Important, simple point. Just give you the simple analogy. We live in a community, the old days back when we thought the Russians were going to bomb us. We built bomb shelters. Okay, beautiful summer day like today. The community is working and growing. The factories are going, people are going to school. The whole community is in a stage of growth. An air raid siren goes off. What does everybody do then? They go down into the bomb shelter. Simple question. When the community is in the bomb shelter, is the community in growth? No, it's in protection. And if they say all clear, everybody comes out, and guess what? You can go back on the job, and then we're back in growth again. That's called an acute response. Here's the problem. It's called a chronic response. What does a chronic fear do? The air raid siren goes off, you go into the bomb shelter, and there's no all clear. That's what a chronic fear is. And why is that important? How long can you survive in the bomb shelter? After a while, you're going to run out of the food and the things you need, and you're not growing anymore. So the more fear you're in, the more you shut your system down. The more you shut your system down, the less growth. And growth is not just from a neonate to an adult. A growth behavior is required every day of your life for the simple reason. Every day of your life, you're losing millions and billions of your cells. If you don't replace them, after a short period of time, the attrition will cause a breakdown of the mechanism and disease. The more fear that you live in, the more protection you hold, the less growth you express, and the more susceptible you are now for disease. Because what have you done? Shut down the system. Everybody needs to grow every day, and fears shut off growth. Okay? So when I look about cells, I give you a simple understanding. Cells move toward or attracted to positive growth-promoting signals. Cells move away from, have an aversion to, or repulsion from signals that are recognized or perceived as being negative and life-threatening. And they get into protection. Growth is toward the signal. Protection is away from the signal. Just to let you know, there are some signals that are irrelevant. They're just background. So you can have a perception of things that are really not going to be growth-oriented or fear-oriented. They're just some things that are out there, background noise. An interesting point, this is exactly the same as a human, except the human has a graded scale. I was looking at individual cells. Now I'm looking at 50 trillion cells. And 50 trillion cells, I could have some percent in growth and some percent protection. But guess what? Same thing, humans and cells. Anything that supports your growth, you will move toward it with open arms. You will go out and get it. And the most important growth factor for a human being is love. Love is what provides harmony to the system. Love is an energy that coordinates and makes the community a whole functioning system. Fear causes the system to pull itself apart and go into protection. Fear gives you this movement. Anything you fear, you get away. You have an aversion for that. You don't want to be there. You will close yourself down. And just like cells, there are some things in life that don't make any difference one way or the other. And it's a graded response. I like something, that's this much. I love something, that's that much. Okay? So the reality is, what does it mean? All the perceptions that you have learned from the time you were actually a prenate, and I'll talk about that, you acquired a value for everything that's in this world. And every time you experience whatever is out there, you will use the value you've ascribed to it to control your behavior. So